Last session, we discussed the nature of truth, truth as correspondence. That's the biblical view. That's the most philosophically astute and well-received view. This time we want to talk about the search for truth, and then go on after that to talk about the significance of truth and possessing truth through knowledge. Part of the problem we face in apologetics in the 21st century is that for several reasons, people have grown weary of pursuing truth. They perhaps have redefined truth as merely convention or as fad or something of that nature. Perhaps they've grown cynical. And I find a lot of people, sadly, who adhere to what you might call whateverism as a philosophy. What do you think about God or the afterlife? Well, whatever. What's the meaning of life? How should we live? Whatever. It's flippant and glib. As Christian apologists, we need to explain biblical truth, and of course we need to defend it. However, there's another element to apologetics that is sometimes ignored or glossed over too quickly, which is trying to instill, or at least engender, a desire for truth with respect to the people we're encountering. This appeals to people's sense of dignity and shame, because the people who have given up too easily on truth, who have said it's simply unknowable, they're skeptics, or they've said truth is whatever you make it. These folks are more difficult to interact with simply because they're not interested. We may have a bang-up argument for the existence of God from Big Bang cosmology, a profound argument for the resurrection of Christ using the minimal facts approach that Gary Habermas and Bill Craig use and I use in my book. But if people are not interested, they're not concerned, they don't care, then this will fall on dead ears. People don't have eyes to see, ears to hear, minds to engage. This is a skill. All apologetics is related to skill, knowledge applied skillfully through virtue. We have to challenge people to not give up on objective truth too quickly. Of course, we don't want them to give up at all. But we need to challenge people not to be superficial, glib, and flippant. This is the way of the postmodern world. This is the way of most entertainers, and often in music, certainly on television, the idea that we can make fun of everything. We have a one-liner for anything that comes up. What we need to do is appeal to people's sense of curiosity, in a good sense, not the bad sense of wanting gossip and things of that nature. But if there is a truth to be known that matters, in fact, that matters for eternity, wouldn't you want to know it? Wouldn't you be interested in applying your intellectual abilities to research this, to consider it? You don't have forever. Life is bracketed by a beginning and an end. So you appeal to people's sense of, let's say, virtuous curiosity, and you can also appeal to people's sense of shame, meaning, why haven't you applied yourself to consider these questions? Is there a God? Is there meaning to life? Is there an afterlife? And if you haven't, maybe you should reconsider how you live. Maybe, instead of spending 20 hours a week in a video game in a fantasy world, you should ask the question whether or not there is another real world, that is, a world to come. Is there an afterlife? Is there a supernatural reality? Isn't that worth some study? I heard John Montgomery years ago say in a lecture that if most people investigated Christianity with as much effort as they put into one college class, they would become Christians. So the importance of truth seeking. We have to realize, though, that human beings east of Eden, under the sun, have a propensity for self-deception. We all do. The self turned in on itself, curved in on itself, as Augustine said in the Confessions. So we have to try to map out a little bit what intellectual virtues are and what intellectual vices are. So if we have cultivated people's sense of curiosity and shame concerning truth-seeking or attaining knowledge about what is most significant, justified true beliefs about what matters most, then we need to think of the virtues pursuant to that. So consider this. Courage is an intellectual virtue. It's a virtue in any aspect of life where you're pursuing a good end, but there is a need for intellectual courage, meaning I am willing to be proven wrong by reality. I am willing to try to get to the bottom of things. I will pursue what is true, what is the case, even if it rebukes me, even if it contradicts me. So we don't want to say something like, don't confuse me with the facts, I've already made up my mind. That is not virtuous, obviously. Intellectual courage. Be willing to pursue the truth wherever it leads you. And if you think you have come to the truth, you have knowledge of something, then be willing to entertain objections to that. And someone cannot be a skilled apologist without the ability of successfully and wisely handling objections. That takes courage as well. Secondly, another intellectual virtue is studiousness. Of course, this addresses the question of being willing to put in the time and the effort and the perspiration of studying things out. So if someone has a very unfavorable view of Christianity, you can certainly ask them, have you studied the Bible? Have you read the Gospels? Have you read one Gospel? If you're a Christian who has certain doubts about Christianity, have you consulted the best sources on this? Have you read the commentaries? Have you read the philosophers and so on? So this is an intellectual virtue, being studious, which requires a certain amount of self-denial, and American culture is not very keen on self-denial. But the question is, are you willing to deny a present pleasure for a potential future good of knowing the truth of the matter? If you put it that way, it's a pretty clear choice, isn't it? We need to challenge people, challenge ourselves to be intellectually courageous and intellectually studious. Secondly, there are intellectual vices to avoid, virtues to pursue, vices to avoid. The first is sloth, laziness, not caring, wanting to think on the cheap. As I said, being flippant, being glib. So instead of, let's say, studying to some extent the case for Christianity, which is a very consequential issue, if it's true and you believe it, you have everything to gain. And if it's true and you fail to believe it, you have everything to lose. Instead of studying, you simply repeat some lines you've heard Bill Maher say, or for that matter, some lines you've heard Richard Dawkins say, which really don't carry very much weight intellectually, but you're willing to glibly, flippantly recite a line or tell a joke or change the subject to something more comfortable or more immediately entertaining. Now, we do not typically endorse sloth in any other area of life. You say, well, I've achieved a lot in my discipline, let's say business, by being lazy. I think most people would say that. I've attained academic distinctions and notoriety by not working very hard. But when it comes to the most significant possible issue, the meaning of life, whether or not there is a God, who is Jesus Christ, many people are lazy. There's a word for this. It's called acedia, Acedia is a Latin phrase for a lack of courage in pursuing the most important things, or a lack of will to pursue the best things in life. It's not saying I give up because I can't do it. It's even worse than that, is I won't even try because it's difficult. Maybe I could attain knowledge, maybe I could attain virtue, but I'd rather be satisfied with present enjoyments or even present pain or present nothing. That is a vice. So when you combine sloth with a kind of cheap hedonism, you get acedia. I'll pursue what's pleasurable now. I will not defer gratification in the hopes of discovering something deeper and more significant. Now, we also need to recognize that human beings, fallen creatures, east of Eden, have the positive will to deceive themselves. And this is not something we merely find in the Bible with the doctrine of depravity. Think of Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is wicked and deceitful. Who can understand it? Philosophers and other writers will reveal this. And I like to read some passages. And I do this because the apologist needs to know what he or she is up against. And sometimes it's not a lack of the person being persuaded, it's that the non-Christian does not want to believe for some kind of reason outside of what's true, some self-interested reason. I have several quotes on pages 142, 143. The first one is by the novelist and philosopher Aldous Huxley, who lived from 1894 to 1963. He said this in his book, Ends and Means. I took it for granted that there was no meaning. This was partly due to the fact that I shared the common belief that the scientific picture of an abstraction from reality was a true picture of reality as a whole, partly also to other non-intellectual reasons. I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning. Consequently, I assumed that it had none, and was able, without any difficulty, to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. Most ignorance is vincible ignorance. We don't know because we don't want to know. It is our will that decides how and upon what subjects we shall use our intelligence. That's significant. It is our will that decides how and upon what subjects we shall use our intelligence. Those who detect no meaning in the world generally do so because, for one reason or another, it suits their books that the world should be meaningless. That's a very sad confession, isn't it? And when he says that he takes the world to be meaningless, he means it's not created, there is no God, and there is no telos to life. So we can engage the world on our terms for our reasons. Most unbelievers have not reached that point, I don't think, or if they have, they're usually not that transparent about it. I think the question to ask Aldous Huxley and the other Huxleys of the world is, if you are wrong, would you want to know it? And if you say no, then you have no intellectual virtue whatsoever. So you're appealing to someone's shame. If someone asked me, if you're wrong, would you want to know it? I'd say I do, definitely. And in a sense, through my study of philosophy, religion, and so on, since I converted as a young man, I've been trying to pursue the best objections to Christianity. And I have not been able to find anything that overthrows the truth and rationality of Christianity. However, we are up against the will to disbelieve. And this is a tough nut to crack. Let me give you another statement This one from Thomas Nagel. Nagel is a contemporary analytic philosopher, very clear, very strong philosopher in many ways, from his book, The Last Word, published in 1997. This is also very remarkable. I quote this on page 143. I am talking about something much deeper, namely the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true. I want atheism to be true, and I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God, exclamation mark. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Very honest, obviously, but your wanting the universe to be theistic or atheistic has nothing to do with whether the universe is or is not atheistic. And I think Nagel knows that. He's being very honest, but it's a sad position to be in. And interestingly, Thomas Nagel has been mounting a campaign against reductive naturalism for about 2 decades. And his most recent book is called Mind and Cosmos. The subtitle is Why Darwinism is Very Likely False. That's a paraphrase of the subtitle. So he's taking on different forms of reductive naturalism or philosophical materialism because he thinks that they're unsatisfying. But he will not embrace Christian theism as the alternative. It's a very strange program. You can find a similar statement in Friedrich Nietzsche that he doesn't desire there to be a God. If there's a God, God would know everything about me. He would crawl into my dirtiest corners and so on. Now, of course, that's a view of God's moral omniscience without forgiveness, without exoneration. So he's just taking God as judge and separating that from God as redeemer. But he doesn't want to get that far because he doesn't want to admit through this character in one of his works that he needs redemption. Now, what we want to see in people, by God's grace, if it happens at all, it's God's grace, epistemic virtue, that is, behaving and thinking wisely with respect to knowledge, not being the fool of the book of Proverbs, who spurns knowledge and wisdom for other supposed goods. So Pascal, in his work Pensées, says what he would like to facilitate, what he would like to inspire in his unbelieving audience. He says this: I should therefore like to arouse in man the desire to find truth, to be ready, free from passion, to follow it wherever he may find it, realizing how far his knowledge is clouded by passions. I should like him to hate his own lustful desires, which automatically make his decisions for him, so that it should not blind him when he makes his choice, he means for Christianity, nor hinder him once he has chosen. And Pascal also said this back in the 17th century: truth is so obscured nowadays and lies so well established that unless we love the truth, we shall never recognize it. He also said, weaklings are those who know the truth, but maintain it only so far as it is in their interest to do so. And apart from that, forsake it. We want to encourage people to pursue the truth, to be intellectually virtuous, and to avoid intellectual vice. There's no simple formula for doing this. We should model this ourselves by being courageous and studious, by not being slothful, not being hedonistic about knowledge and how we live our lives. Try to appeal to people's sense of virtuous curiosity and also appeal to their shame. if they're not applying themselves to these things that matter so much. Let me talk about truth and humility. Because sadly, some people think that in order to be humble, you have to not make strong truth claims. You see this in a book like John Stackhouse's book, Humble Apologetics. He says, we can't know that Christianity is true beyond a reasonable doubt, so we need to be humble. He says, Buddhists and naturalists can be rational in their false beliefs. And he has a very bizarre exegesis of 1 John 1, 1 through 3, that supposedly means postmodernity concurs, no one knows anything for certain. All right, where do we start here? But my understanding, my study, and I'm not alone, is that we can know Christianity to be true beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond any doubt. You can question, you can wonder, you can be less than 100% certain and still have knowledge. Knowledge is not absolutely certain true belief. It is justified true belief. So I think that's false. We cannot know Christianity is true beyond a reasonable doubt. And he hasn't given us any reasons why we should believe him on that. If Buddhism says there is no God and naturalists say there is no God, how could they be rational in those false beliefs when Romans 1 tells us that God has made his existence plain to people? 1:18 through 21 especially. And the idea that the Apostle John would teach in 1 John 1, 1 through 3, or anywhere else, that no one knows anything for certain, is just what philosophers call a howler. It's absurd. It's laughably, palpably ridiculous. Think of the prologue to John. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that has been made. And then down to verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. Then John 1:18. He has made the Father known. The Son, the Logos, has made the Father known. Christ is the revelator. He gives us the knowledge of God in the flesh. Humility has to do with recognizing where truth and goodness comes from and returning thanks for it. It has to do with knowing our intellectual limits. But we don't want to become so humble, as Chesterton said, that we somehow deny our knowledge of the multiplication table. Humility has to do with how we hold knowledge and how we present knowledge, not artificially restricting our knowledge to somehow appear to be humble or meek. We need conviction to have confidence and to be compassionate with unbelievers. Some people deny the need to pursue truth by saying we need to be tolerant, which means we need to be uncertain in order to be charitable to other people. That's a non sequitur. We have to claim we don't really know what's true or false, right or wrong, so we're just going to accept and be tolerant of everyone. Well, you're claiming to know with certainty that tolerance is better than intolerance, so that's a contradiction. And moreover, there's no necessary connection or even logical relationship between skepticism or non-realism and tolerance. Tolerance is a virtue, that is, to be kind and respectful to people with which you disagree. That's the historic American sense of tolerance, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. But having the right to believe whatever you want doesn't mean your belief is right or rational. So I can have a very profitable discussion with someone who I think is radically wrong in their worldview. I can tolerate them, but I don't want to tolerate a false belief. I want to discuss it, and if possible, I want to gently refute it. Another problem in American culture with respect to the pursuit of truth is that people are simply too diverted. They're too distracted by multitasking, trying to do a number of things at once. Read a philosophy text and watch television. Read a philosophy text, at the same time talk on the cell phone. Or engage in deep philosophical arguments through Facebook. These things don't work very well. So we want to uproot godless diversion for the sake of pursuing truth. And furthermore, we need silence to really think hard and think well about matters of eternal consequence. Let me read Soren Kierkegaard on this. He wrote, "In observing the present state of affairs and of life in general, from a Christian point of view, one would have to say it is a disease. And if I were a physician and someone asked me, 'What do you think should be done?' I would answer, 'Create silence, bring about silence.' God's word cannot be heard, and if order to be heard, in the hullabaloo it must be shouted deafeningly with noisy means, then it is not God's word. Create silence. And we humans, we clever fellows, seem to have become sleepless in order to invent every new means to increase noise, to spread noise and insignificance with the greatest possible ease and on the greatest possible scale. Yes, everything has been turned upside down. The means of communication have been perfected, but what is publicized with such hot haste is rubbish. Oh, create silence."